Hello, everyone. We've got about 1 minute before we start. If you have questions, you can throw them in the chat, but we're so glad to have everyone today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tish Mindeman. I am the communications manager here at IFAI. Welcome to our webinar about executive orders and actions and how they're impacting tribal food and agriculture. So if you're not familiar with us, we started at the University of Arkansas by two Indigenous women lawyers in 2013, and we aim to help tribal communities become more tribally food sovereign through four different buckets of work, including law and policy, tribal enterprise, food safety, and then next generation or youth. We do have our youth summit applications open right now, and they'll close on April 1st. And John will throw those in the chat. So, as I said, I'm Tish Mindeman. If you have questions, you can throw them in the chat. We are recording today, so if you don't feel comfortable asking in the chat, you can always send us an email at agpolicy@uark.edu. And today we're going to be hearing from our executive director, Carly Griffith Hotvet. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Carly.
Great. Thanks, Tish. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I am glad to be able to share this information with you and hopefully be able to answer some questions that you all might have. Just to note, a few hours before our webinar last month, where we initially covered the new executive orders that were out at that time, the administration had issued a few more executive orders that were relevant to some of the issues we were presenting on. So if there has been an executive order action that's dropped within the last 24 hours or so, we may not include it on this webinar because we want to make sure that we are taking enough time to research it and be thorough in the information that we're sharing with you. And that fast of a turnaround is a disservice to our stakeholders who would be joining. And so we want to make sure that what we're giving to you is going to be relevant and fully informative. And so don't want to give a half-educated guess. With that, we'll get going. Again, Carly Griffith Hotvet. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and an attorney, been with IFAI for almost 6 years. And let's get going. All right, first we're going to do a refresher, just give you a reminder about what an executive order is. They're official documents that the president uses to manage the operations of the United States. These have some force of law effectively. They're not as strong or as applicable as a statute or a constitutional provision, but they are required to be published in the Federal Register, and they are only effective against federal agencies or persons in their capacities as officers, agents, or employees thereof. So historically, executive orders have been used to address routine administrative matters and the internal operations of federal agencies. But more recently, administrations have used executive orders to more broadly carry out policies and programs, especially when when congressional consideration of matters has stalled or has been misaligned with some of the presidential administrative priorities. All right, next slide. Not everything that's issued by the president's office is an executive order. Sometimes they're an executive action, also known as a presidential action or a memorandum. These are not required to be printed in the Federal Register. They are not required to cite the president's legal authority. Also, the Office of Management and Budget is not required to issue a budgetary impact statement. These are less formal than executive orders, do not carry the same legal weight, and generally they're only applicable to give guidance or direction within the federal government itself. Next slide. So we had some recently issued executive orders and actions. We're going to go through these today. We will cover the EOs, executive orders and actions that have been issued since the last webinar at the end of February. And then if there have been updates or additional informations or occurrences that are relevant to the previously issued executive orders, we'll go over those at the end. This is a list of the executive orders and actions that have occurred. And so we will move on. All right. The first one we're going to talk about today is additional rescissions of executive orders and actions. That is a directive indicating a rescission of an executive order. Any president has the authority to rescind any executive order that has been issued at any time, because they are solely within the scope and responsibility of the office of the president to issue. There were 18 specific executive actions that were mentioned as being withdrawn. The one that's of particular importance to Indian country is Executive Order 14112, which is reforming federal funding and support for tribal nations to better embrace trust responsibilities and promote the next era of tribal self-determination. This executive order had 3 significant tasks. First, it expressed support for self-determination and self-governance across the entire federal government. It then directed agencies to waive regulations, anything that was not statutorily required, and to find flexibility to support tribes in designing new or revising existing programs. It also included opportunities to redesign program applications and reporting requirements to reduce administrative burdens for tribes. As a component of that, there were also additional directives, such as directives to prevent tribes from having to utilize federal funding through a third-party pass-through. Frequently, states would receive funding and then would subsequently administer that to tribes and other entities within that state. There are other examples of non-governmental organizations that would receive funding, and then tribes would have to apply for that funding through the NGO or the third-party entity. That's just one example. And lastly, agencies were also directed to review tribally serving programs and report back on funding shortfalls. The extent to which this executive order was used internally at agencies is unknown. However, through the work that we do with our tribal stakeholders, we are aware of many instances where the executive provisions within the executive order were referred to through a variety of formats to increase self-determination and self-governance opportunities. It was also cited over the past year by tribal leaders and ITO staff in response to the national warehouse crisis that impacted the food distribution program on Indian reservations, and also in disaster response efforts in Alaska Native villages. I am aware of an instance where a tribe was negotiating an alternative funding arrangement with the federal government pursuant to Natural Resource Conservation Service Authority, and that executive order was cited as a way to free up additional funding to be applied to the specific program rather than relying on required overhead commitment for that. Agencies can still use the principles that are referenced within the executive order, but the onus is on federal staff to do so. There's no longer an emphasis on streamlining service for the tribe's benefit to the extent as expressed within that executive order. That executive order is a reference document that a tribe could say, well, we think federal government, you should be doing this, this, or that better aligns or fits with our needs as a tribe or our situation or our circumstances. And you can use this executive order to justify that decision. That no longer exists. We still have that strength of the federal trust obligation, as well as the government to government relationship, which does align with the principles and components contained within that executive order, but there's not that standalone document to point at as a reference and a directive to those federal agencies. Next slide. The next executive order, 14238, references continuing the reduction of the federal bureaucracy. This one was specific to 6 entities, limiting to the extent possible all non-statutory components and functions. What that means is if it was not expressly written in statute under this current administration, the directive to those federal agencies is to pretty much keep it within those bright lines of what the statute specifically authorizes and to not go beyond that. There are the 2 agencies that would be of concern through the lens of food and agriculture would be the Minority Business Development Agency and the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. The Minority Business Development Agency was initially established as the Office of Minority Business Enterprise through an executive order by President Nixon in 1969. But the Carter administration in 1979 reorganized it and renamed it the Minority Business Development Agency. Congress authorized that and codified it as a permanent entity under federal law in 2021. Under the Department of Commerce, it promotes growth and competitiveness of minority-owned businesses, provides business development, access to capital, contracts, and markets. The Minority Business Development Agency has fewer initiatives in the food and agriculture sector compared to those supported by USDA, but economic development opportunities for tribal communities, especially those in rural parts of America, are incredibly important. Small business development, infrastructure, and broadband investments subsequently support agriculture and nutrition investments at the local tribal level. So there is concern that there's going to be a constraint of that economic development that would support, encourage, and enhance food and agriculture systems investments.
Carly, I know that sometimes in Indian country there is a desire to not look at show that Native Americans are a protected political class as opposed to a minority. Is there anything in this that shows that distinction?
So when we're looking at the executive orders through the lens of tribal citizens being a race-based classification or a political status, the forward approach is tribal citizens of federally recognized tribes within the United States enjoy a political class distinction and should not be considered through a race-based lens. And so that's the primary protection. However, when we're talking about, the Minority Business Development Agency, both of those could be considered. So you can be a person of Native ancestry without being somebody who is a tribal citizen and could potentially fall under that classification. There would potentially be some concerns or constraints there. However, folks who are enrolled citizens of their federally recognized tribe should be enjoying classification under a political distinction rather than a race-based distinction. All right. We have a few slides on this one because of the potential impact to access to capital within Indian country, but the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund is one that's referenced as being constrained under this executive order. The CDFI fund was initially enacted in the Rigel Community Development and Regulatory Improvement Act of 1994. And its goal was to improve investment in financial services and education opportunities in communities that lack those services. Specifically in Indian country food and agriculture, access to credit has been a big issue, especially because of the way that we hold land and the difficulty in collateralizing that trust land and restricted land in a way that wouldn't result in significant losses. The other issue is there's frequently credit deserts within Indian country and can make it difficult for farmers and ranchers to be able to access capital or lending products at all, to be able to access them at a competitive market rate without exorbitant interest rates or unfair terms, and can also make it difficult in having payment schedules in a way that makes sense for the type of production as it occurs within Indian country. In 2001, the CDFI fund published a study that identified 17 major barriers to investment in Native communities and offered recommendations to address them. That in turn led to the creation of the CDFI Fund's Native Initiative that supports the creation and expansion of Native CDFIs. Since its inception in 2001, the Native Initiatives program has awarded more than $220 million in financial aid to CDFIs. There's a huge injection of capital investment within Indian country that may not have been available through other resources. It helps fill a gap in the ability of folks who aren't able to access commercial lenders and maybe would not have other alternate means of credit access. All right. So through the Native CDFI network, 86% of Native communities lack a single financial institution that offers affordable financial products and services. In response to that, there are 69 certified Native CDFIs across 27 states. Some of the ag lending CDFIs that you may know are Occupton, Four Bands Community Fund, Lakota Funds, the Native American Community Development Corporation, and the Wind River Development Fund. In the Gaining Ground report that IFAI developed in support of Native Farm Bill Coalition efforts, we highlighted a 2014 study showing that in Indian country, agriculture borrowing needs significantly exceed lending capacity. The additional difficulties that Native borrowers still experience in trying to access private lending systems make Farm Service Agency programs under USDA that's authorized through the Farm Bill a critical source of capital for Native producers. So in addition to CDFIs being authorized through the previous act, that injection of USDA authorized funding to those Native CDFIs that do offer ag lending is critical. And so there's concern that there's going to be a disruption in that flow of funding based on the intended limitation of the CDFI network limiting its action to what is expressly authorized within statute.
Someone in the chat mentioned that CDFI access to credit also applies to fishermen. Is this outside of the aquaculture?
So within the USDA specific framework, it would be because there's some challenges associated with USDA funding and programs being accessible to fishermen and fisheries. However, through general Native CDFI network lending products and activities, that would still be on the table for cuts as well, depending upon how strictly the interpretation of statutory authorization goes here. Our partners at the Intertribal Ag Council have long called for credit extension opportunities through Farm Service Agency and rural development that could be managed by CDFIs. Again, that would put money straight into rural agriculture communities at the local level by the institutions serving those areas. Latest updates that we have from the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs that is within the Executive Office of the President. The quote is, the CDFI fund programs and related activities are statutorily authorized. The CDFI fund is operating as normal and does not anticipate any disruptions to these programs. Senior leadership at Treasury has consistently expressed support for CDFIs. There is no further indication or plan of what potential impacts under this existing executive order are relative specifically to Native CDFIs. We have seen a variety of breadth or shallowness of application of executive orders. And so while this is the current position that's being expressed, we don't have any clarity of whether this will continue or whether there will be any sort of intervening thought process or initiative that could adjust that in the future. So this is where we're at currently. However, it would be good to keep a head up as far as what may be coming down the pipe. Native CDFIs aren't solely funded by federal funds. Our friends at the Native American Agriculture Fund have also released a statement in support of Native CDFIs, pointing out that the Native American Agriculture Fund has provided more than $30 million in funding to 26 Native CDFIs in the past 6 years alone. In my opinion, if NAF says that's a good investment, then it likely is. Someone from my team will also link to NAF's statement in the chat if you want to review that. Just because there may be potential impacts in federal funding to Native CDFIs, that's not their only source. And so there is an opportunity for those funds or for those CDFIs to continue to offer financial products within the communities they serve, even beyond the federal funding that's authorized. However, it would significantly impact the amount of funding that they were able to provide. All right, next slide. The next slide is about the Executive Order 14241, immediate measures to increase American mineral production. This order prioritizes the approval and permitting of mineral production projects, with agencies required to identify and expedite priority projects. It directs the Secretary of Interior to identify sites for leasing and development, and enables Defense Production Act authorities to encourage public and private investments in these projects. The Department of Defense and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation are also authorized to advance domestic mineral production through the federal financial support. This will impact federal lands nationwide. It will speed up the rates that permits are used, including impacting the amount of reviews of environmental impacts. Given significant portions of tribal reservations and areas within tribal jurisdiction abut or overlap federal lands in some instances, these expedited projects have the potential for significant impact to Indian country. This is an order where tribal consultation for these specific activities authorized under the executive order should occur, whether it is identification of expediting a permit or authorizing a permit. There should still be an opportunity for tribes to consult and be heard within these frameworks, especially if tribal interests are going to be impacted. Within this context, there was a recent data release of BIA tract-specific data, including subsurface and mineral ownership, on the ArcGIS website. That information was quickly reformatted and reorganized and then pulled down. There was a Dear Tribal Leader letter issued by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was sent last summer regarding some of this BIA tract level specific data, but no final information about intended public release was made available that I've been able to find. There is speculation. Let me back up. This specific tract level data had been requested by multiple entities, and most of those entities were told that that tract level data did not exist. We know it does exist because it was published, whether intentionally or inadvertently, within the last few weeks. And some of our partner organizations have been able to capture that information and download it before it was pulled from the website. There is some speculation that release of that tract level data may be aligned with the intent behind this executive order, because that tract level data includes identification of where subsurface or mineral ownership exists within that BIA tract specific information. It remains to be seen what the intent behind that release was, or whether it was intentional or inadvertent. However, there is concern because there was communication from BIA that that tract level specific data did not exist, that it would not be shared publicly, and that it was not available. And now it's obvious that it does exist. It is tracked, it is available, and there's concern about why that information came out and then was quickly pulled down.
Carly, you mentioned environmental impact in when you were speaking about this. Since there is likely to be a large reduction in force at EPA, will this in turn slow that process down as well, or are they just going to try and push it through without those things?
So there are other executive orders that direct the streamlining or elimination of the requirement for environmental impact statements or environmental analyses. Through many of those EI or EA opportunities, there was a conduit for tribes to be able to participate in any federally funded projects or projects on federal lands that had the potential to impact tribal interests. With that expedition of environmental impacts or environmental analyses that are performed and previously performed in accordance with statutory obligations, there's concern that there's going to be a reduction or an elimination of the opportunity for tribes to provide comment and feedback related to some of those federally funded projects or projects on federal lands. And some instances, the reduction or elimination of an environmental impact statement or an environmental analysis could potentially be beneficial for tribes. I'm thinking of agricultural resource management plans, where the statute authorizes the creation of those and does not reference a requirement to have an environmental impact statement. However, under the application of the act through the BIA as they administer it, BIA has been requiring environmental impact statements. And so theoretically that could address or eliminate that additional requirement for tribes that are trying to put together agricultural resource management plans. However, in other instances, say where the Army Corps of Engineers is involved and you're looking for a 404 permit that would provide a conduit for tribes to participate and provide feedback and comment, or Section 106 consultations under the ACHP, there's concern that there would be in those instances when an environmental impact statement or an EI or an EA would be required, there could be a reduction in the ability of tribes to participate and provide feedback and comment in that process.
Carly, real quick, it's John Banpool. Could you explain what tract level data is? I could do it, but I figure you're going to be much better at it.
Yeah. So when we're talking about tract, it's actually tract with a T, with two T's, TRACT, tract level. That is down to the specific individual tract of land or, perimeter of what that interest is, whether it's a surface interest or a subsurface interest. So it is this particular plot in this location that has this specific identifier associated with it. It gets down to, the individual ownership level. Information collected and analyzed at the level of smaller than that. It's not census data tract. It is parcel, like property parcel level tract data. So it's like if you work in GIS and are familiar with that, or you've seen your tribal GIS map, it's like identifying individual restricted parcels of land or individual trust tracts, rather than this all is generally, land that's held in trust or restricted status within this reservation. It is individually identified at that point. It does not necessarily identify individual owners within that tract, but it gives that specific tract level data and information about whether it's surface ownership, subsurface ownership, or a mix of both. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Executive Order 14243, eliminating waste and saving taxpayer dollars by consolidating procurement. This is one that we're particularly concerned about, with the potential to delay and disrupt existing procurement standards that are performed by multiple locations, multiple entities across the federal government. Different agencies have different procurement needs. The intent is to consolidate those that are more uniform or more regularly used across those agencies. However, it remains to be seen what type of efficiency or effectiveness is actually going to be implemented through this executive order. Within 30 days, agencies must submit plans to the General Services Administration to take over domestic procurement that's permitted by law. GSA will also take on all acquisition contracts. Within 90 days, GSA has to develop a plan that's due at that time regarding domestic procurement that they're supposed to be doing under this executive order. It also designates the GSA administrator as the executive agent for all government-wide acquisition contracts for information technology. We are talking about billions of dollars of procurement and government services being consolidated within a single entity. I do not see how GSA has capacity to take on all of that contracting and acquisition requirements, especially considering how much of that is spread across so much of the variety of federal agencies and sub-programs. Some of the chatter that I've been seeing and hearing from federal employees and other agencies and entities is significant concern about what the impact of this executive order is going to look like in the ability to timely procure and secure goods and services that would be transferred to GSA specifically. In relation to Indian country food and ag sectors, GSA is already strained after cuts due to personnel. Fewer people plus more proposals, less people, more work makes it more difficult to actually push out a final product. We expect to see significant backlog. Centralized procurement may not adequately address the unique need of every agency, especially agencies that are working with Indian country. Centralizing procurement could also favor larger contracts at a larger scale that limits opportunities for small and minority-owned businesses. An example of what that might look like could be something the way that USDA currently operates its vendor certification program. You have to become an authorized vendor to make a bid on a contract, and how it works within USDA procurement, their requests for material or for goods or services or food products is so broad. Usually only very large companies can meet that quantity demand, and in order to secure that market, they're also willing to, drive down the price so that other vendors can't compete in order to secure that contract. While there are set-asides for small business opportunities or smaller vendor bids, that likely within USDA, that likely would not be something that would be replicated at GSA through this executive order. I haven't seen anything that would indicate that. If there's a potential to impact food acquisitions, like those that would impact the food distribution program on Indian reservations or any other type of procurement that would impact tribally serving programs, goods, services, etc., especially those to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there needs to be tribal consultation. When we're talking about tribal consultation, we have not seen a significant influx of tribes bringing suits related to that. However, there is one that specifically references the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Native American Rights Fund is supporting 3 tribes and 5 individual tribal citizens in bringing trust violation claims against the Bureau of Indian Education based on administrative actions and decisions that impacted staffing and other service availability through that. And so that's one that we are watching in order to better understand where the chips will fall related to the requirement to consult with tribes as these actions are being taken and implemented.
Does GSA commonly perform tribal consultations? I know that USDA does, and obviously BIA, but is that something that GSA that we see them do?
That's not something that I'm aware of. That's not to say that it hasn't happened before, but it's not something that I'm aware happens frequently or regularly. But again, since USDA and other tribally serving programs have previously largely been in control of their procurement and solicitations that are intended to serve or intended to be routed through the programs that serve tribes, we haven't necessarily seen the same type of requirement at GSA to do that because they're being served through BIA or USDA, and those entities do regularly consult. So it remains to be seen if GSA is going to step in and perform tribal consultation related to the particularities of this executive order. Okay. This next slide, we'll be talking about an executive action, which again is different from an executive order. This one is related to strengthening the suitability and fitness of the federal workforce. This delegates authority to the Director of the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, to make final suitability determinations and take action related to employment, including to direct the removal of employees who do not meet the suitability criteria. There is no specific information about what criteria is considered within a suitability analysis. There is no bullet point list, no guidance, no information that has been published or pulled together indicating what additional criteria needs to be met in order for a federal employee to meet a suitability analysis. This executive action also directs the Office of Personnel Management to propose regulations to amend Part 731 of Title V in the Code of Federal Regulations. That part, implements appropriate rules and procedures for those determinations and actions. TBD on when that's going to occur. This executive order also directs agency heads to refer cases to the Office of Personnel Management for final suitability determinations and actions on their employees. USDA will not make determinations on their own employees' suitability for a job serving tribal producers. OPM will. And it's not just USDA, any other federal agency will not be the entity to make final determinations on their own employees' suitability. The Office of Personnel Management will. It also is intended to speed up the decision-making process, giving a 5-day timeline. If you are a federal employee and you have a negative action taken against you based on a suitability determination, you have 5 days to take action to try to intervene in that process until there's a termination or a negative action. Again, no specific criteria listed on what behavior, what criteria, what considerations would result in a termination based on an assessment of non-suitability. Short staffing of tribally facing positions or tribally serving positions was an issue prior to this action. In some regions within BIA, there are already a 30% vacancy rate. And so when we see continued actions intended to scrutinize federal employees, there's an anticipation of this only exacerbating that vacancy problem and more difficulty in filling positions that are intended to serve tribes in Indian country. We anticipate it will get worse should hiring and firing decision all be placed at the Office of Personnel Management that doesn't necessarily regularly deal with tribes specifically, or their issues or complexities of Indian country, especially in the realm of food and agriculture. We're concerned about this. However, we also know that if every single assessment of every single federal employee has to be routed through the Office of Personnel and Management, again, there's going to be a significant backlog. Who is going to be in charge of making those final reviews and final determinations? We don't know. Next slide.
Hey, Harley, it's John. Real quick, we had a question on this from Berdina Sanchez about the mineral rights one. Real quick, is that okay to ask it?
Sure. Since tribes only have surface rights on tribal lands, what protection, if any, is in place against mineral production? So many tribes also have mineral interests, and not just surface rights. There often is duality there. It's less frequent, as mineral rights were frequently separated from surface rights, but there are tribes and individual tribal citizens that do hold individual mineral interests. If mineral production is not something that a tribe wants to see or encourage, as surface holders, there are supposed to be opportunities to negotiate how that development is occurring and what type, the federal government still has a trust obligation to make a decision related to any tangible asset that they are managing on behalf of a tribe to make a decision in the best interest of the tribe. Now, frequently what the federal government considers to be the best interest of a tribe and what a tribe sees as its own best interest can frequently misalign. And so again, that's how consultation is supposed to occur. If consultation does not occur in that context, the remedy from a legal perspective is a lawsuit. However, I know even as an attorney myself, that sometimes it takes more than just pursuit of legal rights and interests. It also requires additional education of folks that are working in that space on the side of the federal government, public campaigns and support for those particular actions or interests that are at issue. There's a variety of things that need to occur. The other opportunity that also exists, every single person within the United States has the ability to talk to their congressional delegation about what issues are happening and seeking constituent services through that route. So in addition to a lawsuit, those are some opportunities that exist, and sometimes it really boils down to what the particular issue is, what the particular resource, asset, or land interest is. And also, take a look at treaty rights. There may be some specific treaty rights that are not being considered or implemented related to, that particular matter. Every tribe that has treaties will have different treaty provisions. So I can't make a blanket statement about that generally, but I always encourage tribes to know and understand your current and existing treaty provisions and make sure that you're advocating for yourselves when it comes to securing those rights.
We've got about 20 minutes left. But I was going to ask, is this executive action currently part of any lawsuits that are happening?
Not to my knowledge, the one about strengthening suitability and fitness of the federal workforce. I'm not aware of that. It doesn't mean that there aren't any. However, usually it requires some sort of action to occur to have a negative impact against somebody to have standing to bring a lawsuit. And I'm not aware if anybody has standing yet, considering this is more recent and has not been fully implemented. Okay. All right, Executive Order 14154, Unleashing American Energy Deadlines. Agency heads have been directed to suspend or revise burdensome regulations impacting domestic energy production. There's no definition within the executive order about what constitutes a burdensome criteria for a regulation. This one is one that we covered in the webinar that we did last month, giving updates about executive orders and executive actions. Many of those had specific deadlines within them or timelines directing action. And so the ones where those deadlines have since passed, we wanted to give you some information about where they're at currently. For this one specifically, agencies were directed to suspend, revise, or rescind actions that were unduly burdensome to domestic energy resources by February 19th. Outside of the Department of Energy, no other publicly issued plans are available. Interior did issue internal guidance to review any burdensome regulations that were impacting energy production. It also ordered the chairman on the Council of Environmental Quality to provide guidance on the National Environmental Policy Act and rescind the council's NEPA implementing regulations. On February 25th, the Council on Environmental Quality published an interim final rule and took public comment through March 27th, 2025, which is today. If put into final effect, it reverts to the original NEPA requirements, again, that are statutorily obligated, and restores prior procedures for environmental impact assessments. Eliminating environmental assessments would more rapidly hasten project approvals, but again, lessen considerations for environmental protections. Neither the original nor the implementing regulations required tribal consultations. In a similar vein, this executive order also requires the EPA administrator to issue guidance that includes possibly eliminating, quote unquote, the social cost of carbon calculation from any federal permitting or regulatory decision by March 21st. As far as we've been able to see in research, there are no publicly available guidance documents yet related to that issued guidance. More rapid development of these projects might have positive impacts for tribes that have energy focused projects, but it also comes with the challenge of, shortening the time for tribes with interest related to those developments to provide input on their feedback or additional participation in, potential solutions or mitigation to concerns that tribes may have related to their interests and resources. Let's go to the next slide. Executive Order 14171, restoring accountability in policy influencing positions within the federal workforce deadlines. OMB was directed to issue guidance on schedules for policy and career federal employees by February 19th. The Office of OMB issued that guidance on January 27th. It recommended moving significant portions of the federal workforce to different classifications with fewer job protections. The director's memorandum said that agencies should consider positions with significant policy making, policy determining, or policy advocating duties, such as directing organizational units, managing programs, making binding decisions, participating in grant making, and advocating for agency policies or administration priorities as scheduled policy or career. Recategorizing these positions means that these employees will be moved from the traditional civil service system into a new employment category with fewer job protections, including the right to appeal dismissals through the Merit Systems Protection Board. USDA and Department of Interior or BIA positions, again, are chronically short-staffed, especially in Indian country serving roles. This is a way to essentially make people easier to fire through this executive order with the intent to reduce or eliminate positions or staff that do not meet the directives as considered within this executive order. We're concerned about it because a reduction in federal staffing means a reduction in direct service provision, which will make it more difficult for tribes and tribal producers to access the services that they are currently eligible for and entitled to pursuant to federal programs, federal trust obligations, and that government to government relationship. Next slide. Follow up on Executive Order 14210 regarding the President's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, Workforce Optimization Initiative deadlines. This is one where there's a mandated hiring ratio that one new employee cannot be hired unless there are 4 that leave or vacate their positions. It also establishes the DOGE teams at agencies to lead the effort. This executive order required agency heads to turn into OMB a report that identifies any statutes that establish the agency or subcomponents of the agency as statutorily required by March 15th. So again, this was asking each federal agency to take a look at what statute authorizes their existence and what specifically is included within that statute as far as what services or actions that they are supposed to be providing or implementing, with the intent that anything outside of that needs to be constrained in accordance with this current administration's priorities. It requires agency heads to also undertake preparation for large-scale reductions in force. We had previously seen that all probationary employees, not all, but the vast majority of probationary employees were terminated under the guise of poor performance, despite whether or the performance not aligning with the needs of the federal government at the time, regardless of whether their performance evaluations actually reflected that designation. There has been a lawsuit, and many of those probationary employees were directed to be reinstated. However, while many are back on the payroll, many of those employees have not been given credentials or access to their workspaces or the necessary networks or databases or programs in order to actually perform their jobs. So there's still some limbo there about, while technically people are employed, they're not actually able to perform the functions of their job duties due to not having access to the things that they need to do the work. There was no deadline for when the OMB plan had to be submitted. So far, OMB has issued guidance for agencies to use to reduce their staff, but has not publicly released the plan yet. For the DOGE teams, it's unclear going off of publicly available data, and there was no deadline on when those teams needed to be in place. That said, anecdotal and media reports of staffers from the newly created department appear to confirm their presence across a breadth of federal departments and agencies. There's concern that many of the people that are working within the DOGE framework may not have the higher level management experience to understand the ins and outs of some of the federal programs and policies and operations at that level across, a multitude of agencies and interests. The other thing that we're seeing is DOGE is relying on AI to review many programs, many activities, and frequently AI is casting too wide of a net when it comes to what is getting caught in it, and many programs that are being caught under an analysis of certain words or other criteria are overly broad and are being impacted, and then there is later reversal of the intent to eliminate that program. So we're concerned about and watching that to see what that looks like and anticipate additional lawsuits related to that particular matter. Executive Order 14151, ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing deadlines. This executive order directed agency heads to terminate all DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and environmental justice offices, positions, initiatives, and related actions. It also called on them to provide a list of relevant positions and expenditures and assess the operational impact of previous DEI programs by March 21st. As of March 19th, the Departments of Education, Veterans Affairs, Transportation, Defense, Interior, Energy, Justice, Agriculture, and Housing and Urban Development have released memos, press releases, and secretary orders that are taking the necessary steps to fulfill the directives outlined in the order. None of these memos mention tribes, and the guiding light on this distinction between DEI and tribal citizenship and tribal government sovereignty appears to have been established. We know there was a memo issued by Secretary Bergram at the Department of Interior indicating the intent to continue to provide government to government relationship efforts and meet that federal trust obligation to the tribes. That secretarial order is linked in the chat. Thank you for that, John. Recognize the sovereignty of Native nations by separating them from programs related to DEI and gender ideology extremism. That is the language that the current administration is using. The secretarial order also referenced Native Hawaiians. All right.
Did it,
So,
did
go ahead.
it also include Alaska Natives or just tribes and Native Hawaiians?
The or specifically says tribes and Native Hawaiians, but I believe I've understood that that Alaska Natives would fall into that reference.
That's correct. Great. Okay, that is our last slide. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We do have a few minutes for questions. If you want to drop those in the chat or raise your hand, we'll try and monitor that. But we do have a little bit of time. Again, if you're not comfortable asking a question in the chat or live, we do have our ag policy at uark.edu available for you to submit questions to. We may end up having to give you the lawyer answer, which is it depends, or I will have to do some research and get back to you, but that's what we're here for. So at this time, I'll open it up and take some questions if there are any.
Buck Jones was asking about LFPA 2025.
So while the review of some federal funding, especially that came through recently authorized under the Biden administration funding allocations, the Local Food Purchase Assistance Program, the last funding announcement for 2025 funding that came through, and some tribes have been selected and awarded. Those funds were rescinded, and that opportunity was rescinded. There are some tribes that had applied for that and had received notice that they were awarded and were going to be able to do continued activities under that award. However, that has been withdrawn, unfortunately. And John dropped additional information in the chat about that particular matter. Previously funded local food purchase assistance awards under the prior two iterations will continue. However, it's just the most recent one that has been pulled back.
And that's not an executive order, that's an administrative decision, is correct?
That's correct. Yes. That funding was authorized by Congress to come through and was pushed out to USDA to administer. The withdrawal of that pursuant to the presidential administration doesn't necessarily align with the authorization and appropriation by Congress of those funds.
As you're continuing to think of questions, we send out a policy brief and newsletter every week that updates you on things going on like executive orders and congressional hearings, and you can sign up on our short link right there, which is bit.ly/IFAI news. And then you can keep up to date with us on all of our social media platforms.
Becky Chandler asked a question in the chat about whether there are any other executive orders, action items, or administration decisions that we feel would impact tribal nutrition related efforts. The ones that we talked about today are the ones that are most concerned. The ones related to procurement are ones that we are keeping a close eye on to see whether there will be any impacts there. Within that directive to GSA related to procurement, it specifies 10 categorical areas that would be considered domestic goods. Food is not one that's considered in those. However, we are watching that to see if there are any unintended consequences that come out of that at this time. Other than that, I'm not aware of any that would specifically impact tribal nutrition related efforts. Any updates on the frozen BIA funds pertaining to RCPP? I do not have any updates on that at this time. I'm not aware of any movement related to RCPP funding release. I know that's a particular concern as it's impacting many folks within that area, but it's not something that we have updated information on. All right, we have time for a few more questions. If anybody wants to drop in the chat or raise a hand, we're able to pick that up. Can we go backward to go forward and ask for donations for future leaders to meet by actual US mail invite? This is because there are those keeping a closer eye on us, Indigenous peoples on the internet. I mean, whatever conduit of communication that's available, that's definitely something that could be made use of. We here at IFAI will continue to use the platforms that are available to us so that we can have the broadest reach. However, how you all choose to communicate within your networks, especially if you're concerned about any type of scrutiny, that there's definitely alternate means that can be pursued to communicate. However, we'll continue to push information out on our webinars, through our newsletters, and be available on the website as well as responsive to emails. All right, we'll do a last call for questions. If there are any, we'll give you another minute. Okay. While we're waiting on any last questions, I do want to say thank you so much for joining us today, Wado, and any sort of questions or information that we can help provide to our tribal stakeholders as the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We are happy to hear from you. If we don't have the information, we can connect you with our partner organizations, or we can take some time to do the legal and regulatory related research to hopefully answer your questions and get you some information to help inform your decision making and offer that guidance to support the efforts that your tribe is engaging in. Okay. With that, we are always happy to hear from you. If you're interested in supporting IFAI, we do have links on our webpage for how to support us if that's something you're interested in, either by sharing our information out or considering financial contributions. We're always happy to hear from you. Again, please give us a call. And with that, I will say Dododago Ha'i, which is until we meet again. Thank you so much. Please feel free to check out all the links in the chat. This is being recorded and we will post this to our YouTube channel at a later time. Last question. The question is, what's our future? I think that's a good reflection and option for us to take home and be thinking about where are we now and where do we go from here? One of the things that I have been reminding myself is that, our people have survived much worse. We are still here. We will not only continue to survive, but we will thrive. And we will make sure that we are working together to accomplish that goal. So with that, Wado.